July 14th, 1944, a muddy field near Saint-Lô, Normandy. Sergeant Curtis Culin of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron pressed his pencil against rain-soaked paper, watching another Sherman tank attempt what 49 days of combat had proven impossible. The 32-ton machine lurched forward, its steel nose rising skyward as it climbed the ancient earth embankment. For 3 seconds, the tank's belly armor, 13 millimeters of soft steel, hung exposed to the German 88 millimeter gun hidden 200 yards away. The crack of the anti-tank weapon arrived before the sound of impact. Fire erupted through the driver's hatch. The Sherman crashed backward, its tracks throwing mud as 5 American tankers died before they could escape. Culin had witnessed this scene 17 times in the past week. 17 tanks, 85 men, all victims of obstacles that had stood in these Norman fields since the time of Julius Caesar. What Culin could not know, as he sketched crude diagrams in his notebook, was that within 10 days his solution to this ancient problem would transform over 500 American tanks into hedge-cutting machines. Within 3 weeks, these modified vehicles would shatter the German defensive line that had contained the Allied invasion since the 6th of June. And within 6 weeks, the entire German 7th Army would collapse in what military historians would later call the most decisive American breakthrough since the Civil War. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The hedgerows of Normandy were not mere agricultural boundaries. They were living fortifications, constructed over 2 millennia by Norman farmers, who had piled stone and earth into linear mounds to mark property lines and contain livestock. Centuries of root systems from oak trees, hawthorn bushes, and brambles had transformed these barriers into obstacles that could stop a tank more effectively than concrete. Each mound stood between 4 and 12 feet high, with bases often 20 feet thick. The smaller fields they enclosed, rarely larger than 300 yards across, created a patchwork of natural fortresses stretching 50 miles inland from the invasion beaches. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American First Army, would write in his memoirs that he had prepared for many challenges in France, but not for this maze. The Bocage country negated every advantage of American mobility and firepower. Each field became its own battlefield, each hedgerow its own fortress wall. The German Wehrmacht had recognized the defensive potential of this landscape immediately after occupying France in 1940. For 4 years, they studied every hedgerow, mapped every field, and calculated fields of fire from thousands of concealed positions. They transformed what nature had, created by accident, into what German doctrine called the ideal terrain for resource-conserving defense. A single German 88 millimeter gun crew with supporting infantry could hold up an entire American battalion for hours, sometimes days. The crisis had begun on D-Day +1, when the American 4th Infantry Division first encountered the hedgerows beyond Utah Beach. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Taylor of the 1st Battalion, 22nd Infantry Regiment, reported to divisional headquarters that his men had advanced only 300 yards in 6 hours, while suffering 43 casualties. "We cannot see the enemy," he transmitted. "We cannot maneuver. We can only die in place." American tactical doctrine, developed in the wide-open training grounds of Louisiana and Texas, called for tanks to lead infantry advances across open ground. In Normandy, this doctrine collapsed within hours. When tanks attempted to drive through gaps in hedgerows, they were channeled into killing zones where German anti-tank weapons waited. When they attempted to climb over the embankments, they exposed their vulnerable belly armor to enemy fire. The 13 millimeters of steel protecting a Sherman's underside could not stop even a Panzer, the handheld anti-tank weapon distributed to every German infantry squad. Captain Charles Cawthon of the 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Infantry Division, described the first attempts to breach the hedgerows in his after-action report. The tank would charge forward, its 30 tons grinding toward the embankment. As it climbed, the driver would lose sight of everything except sky. The tank commander, if he dared keep his hatch open, would attempt to guide the driver. Then would come the sound every tanker learned to dread, the crack of an 88. The tank would shudder, smoke would pour from the hatches, and 5 more American soldiers would be dead before they understood what had happened. By June 15th, American forces had suffered 12,000 casualties while advancing an average of only 5 miles inland from the beaches. At this rate, First Army intelligence officers calculated the American army would cease to exist as an effective fighting force before reaching the Seine River. The German defenders, meanwhile, were suffering casualties at a rate of only 1 to 4 compared to the Americans. The Hedgerows were not merely slowing the American advance, they were defeating it. Major General J. Lawton Collins, commander of 7th Corps, convened an emergency meeting on June 18th at his headquarters in a requisitioned Norman farmhouse. Present were representatives from the Ordnance Department, the Tank Destroyer Command, and the 1st Army Engineering Staff. Collins, known throughout the army as Lightning Joe for his aggressive tactics in the Pacific, slammed his fist on the oak table hard enough to make the maps jump. "Gentlemen, we are being defeated by agricultural archaeology. Find me a solution, or we will be fighting in these fields until Christmas if we survive that long." The assembled officers proposed various solutions, each more impractical than the last. Engineers suggested using explosive charges to blow gaps in the hedgerows, but tests demonstrated this would require over £1 million of high explosive to breach all the obstacles between the American positions and open country. Bulldozers were tested but proved too vulnerable to enemy fire and too slow to be useful under combat conditions. White phosphorus shells were fired at the embankments but proved completely ineffective against earth and root systems that had been growing since before America was discovered. Meanwhile, the German defenders were perfecting their hedgerow tactics with Prussian efficiency. Oberst Friedrich von der Heydte, commanding the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, issued tactical instructions that were later captured and translated by American intelligence on June 23rd. The document revealed the methodical nature of German defensive planning. Each hedgerow position is to be defended as follows, von der Heydte had written. Machine guns at the corners provide interlocking fields of fire. Anti-tank guns or Panzerfaust teams are positioned to engage the exposed bellies of climbing tanks. Snipers eliminate tank commanders who expose themselves. Snipers eliminate tank commanders who expose themselves. When American pressure becomes overwhelming, withdraw to the next hedgerow and repeat the process. The German system was devastatingly effective. On June 24th, the American 2nd Battalion, 115th Infantry Regiment, supported by a company of Sherman tanks from the 2nd Armoured Division, attempted to advance across a single field near the village of Villiers-Fossard. The attack began at 0600 hours. By noon, 7 of 14 tanks had been destroyed. 123 infantrymen were casualties, and the battalion had gained exactly 0 yards of ground. The German defenders, elements of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, reported losses of 13 men. Sergeant Culin had been observing these failures with eyes trained by experience that West Point graduates often lacked. Before the war, he had grown up on a farm in Cranford, New Jersey. He had worked summers as a welder in his uncle's steel fabrication shop. He understood metal, stress points, and practical engineering in ways that made sense to men who worked with their hands rather than theories. On the evening of July 2nd, Culin attended a briefing where Lieutenant Colonel John Wellborn of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron expressed his frustration to the assembled tankers and reconnaissance troops. "We need to get through these hedgerows, not over them," Wellborn said, his voice tight with the strain of watching his men die. "Every time we try to climb, we expose ourselves. Every time we use the gaps, they're waiting for us. We need a different solution." That night, Culin could not sleep. The sound of distant artillery rolled across the Norman countryside as he walked among the destroyed tanks littering the fields his unit had tried to cross. He examined each burned-out hull with the careful attention of a man trying to understand failure so completely that success became inevitable. He noticed patterns in the wreckage. When tanks attempted to climb hedgerows, their tracks often lost traction as the center of gravity shifted backward. The tank would slide back down the embankment, sometimes throwing a track and leaving the vehicle immobilized and helpless. The more he looked, the more he understood that everyone had been thinking about the problem incorrectly. The engineers and ordnance officers were trying to overcome the hedgerows through force, explosive force, mechanical force, any kind of force. What if the solution was not to overcome the hedgerows, but to cut through them? What if tanks could plow through the earth embankments the way a farmer's blade cuts through soil? The idea crystallized during an informal discussion among tankers on July 3rd. A soldier from Tennessee, known to the others only as Roberts, made an observation that most men laughed at. "Why don't we get some saw teeth and put them on the front of the tank?" Roberts said. "Cut through these hedges like butter." The laughter that followed was not mean-spirited. These were exhausted men who had watched too many friends die, and dark humor was sometimes the only armor they had left against the horror of it all. But Culin did not laugh. He recognized something in Roberts' casual suggestion that others had missed the essential truth that cutting was more efficient than climbing. That night, Culin began developing the concept using the practical engineering skills he had learned before the army had made him a soldier. Working with Private John Cocker, a fellow soldier who had been a machinist in civilian life, Culin examined the German beach obstacles, still littering the sand from D-Day. Among these obstacles were hundreds of Czech hedgehogs, massive steel anti-tank barriers constructed from crossed steel beams. The Germans had scattered thousands of these along the Normandy beaches to impale landing craft before they could reach shore. Culin pointed at the twisted steel beams, some of them 3 meters long and 20 centimeters thick. High-quality carbon steel, designed to withstand impacts that would shatter lesser metals. "What if we cut these up and weld them to the front of a tank?" Culin said to Cocker. "Like tusks on a wild boar. The tank keeps its nose down, drives straight through the hedgerow instead of trying to climb it." Cocker examined the German steel with the critical eye of a man who understood metallurgy. "The steel is good quality," he said after a moment. "Might work, but we'd need to calculate the angle exactly right. Too high and the prongs won't bite into the earth. Too low and the tank will plow straight into the ground and stall." They spent several days working in secret, not wanting to appear foolish if their idea failed. Using a damaged Sherman tank that had thrown a track during a botched river crossing, they fabricated their prototype. They cut sections from the German beach obstacles using borrowed cutting torches, then welded 4 prongs to the front of the tank's hull. The prongs extended approximately 2 feet beyond the tank's nose and were angled at 30 degrees. The design was crude but functional. Each prong weighed approximately 200 pounds, adding 800 pounds to the tank's front end. Surprisingly, this additional weight actually improved traction by pressing the tank's nose down and keeping the front drive sprockets firmly engaged with the tracks. On July 14, 1944, they conducted their private demonstration for General Bradley. Captain James Dew, the 102nd Cavalry's operations officer, had arranged for senior officers to witness the test after Culin had shown him crude sketches of the concept. Bradley stood with his staff in a muddy field, his expression skeptical. He had listened to dozens of proposals for solving the hedgerow problem. Most had proven worthless. The modified Sherman sat at one end of the field, facing a typical Norman hedgerow, 12 feet of earth, stone, and tangled roots that had defeated American armor for 49 consecutive days. The tank's engine roared. The Sherman lurched forward, accelerating to 5 miles per hour. The steel prongs bit into the earth embankment with a grinding tear that every man present could hear over the engine noise. For a moment, it seemed the tank would stall, its engine laboring against centuries of compacted earth and root systems. Then, with a sound like tearing fabric magnified 1,000 times, the hedgerow split apart. Earth and vegetation exploded outward as the tank burst through into the next field. Its nose stayed level. Its belly armor remained protected. The entire breakthrough had taken less than 30 seconds. Bradley watched in silence as the tank completed its demonstration and returned through the gap it had created. When the engine finally shut down and Sergeant Culin climbed out, Bradley approached him directly. "Sergeant, how quickly can we modify 500 tanks?" The question hung in the Norman air like a revelation. First Army's ordnance companies immediately began calculating production requirements. The answer they delivered to Bradley was both encouraging and audacious. Using the German beach obstacles as raw material, welding teams could modify 50 tanks per day. There were enough Czech hedgehogs scattered across Omaha and Utah beaches to modify over 600 tanks. The steel that Hitler had placed to stop the invasion would now tear through his defensive lines. Lieutenant Colonel John Medaris of the United States Army Ordnance Department received orders that same evening. He was to coordinate production of the hedge-cutting devices across all ordnance units in the American sector. Additional arc welding equipment and trained crews were to be flown from England immediately. The modifications were given the highest priority classification, higher than ammunition resupply, higher than vehicle maintenance, higher than almost anything except casualty evacuation. Within 48 hours, ordnance units throughout the Normandy beachhead were working around the clock. The 111th Ordnance Company set up cutting and welding stations under camouflage netting to prevent German aerial observation. Teams of soldiers scavenged the beaches for Czech hedgehogs, cutting them apart with acetylene torches and hauling the steel sections to the modification sites. The work was brutally hard. Each prong had to be cut exact specifications, then shaped and welded to the tank's hull at precisely the correct angle. Welders worked in shifts, their torches throwing blue-white light across the Norman fields throughout the night. By July 22nd, over 300 tanks had been modified with what were officially designated as Culin hedgerow cutters. The tank crews, however, had adopted their own terminology. They called the devices Rhinos, and tanks so equipped became known as Rhino tanks. The name spread through the First Army with the speed of all good soldier slang, descriptive, memorable, and somehow perfectly capturing the brutal efficiency of steel tusks tearing through earth. The first combat test came during preparatory attacks before Operation Cobra. The American 90th Infantry Division, which had suffered 2,000 casualties in 2 weeks while advancing only 3 miles, attacked on July 23rd with 15 Rhino-equipped tanks leading the assault. The results shocked everyone who witnessed them. In 4 hours, the division advanced 2 miles, the same distance that had previously cost them 2 weeks of fighting. They destroyed 17 German defensive positions. They suffered only 43 casualties. The Rhino tanks simply drove through hedgerows at unexpected points, appearing in German flanks and rear areas before defenders could reposition their weapons. Brigadier General Raymond McLean, the division commander, sent an urgent message to First Army headquarters that evening. The hedgerow cutter has restored mobility to American armor. Previous tactical doctrine is obsolete. Recommend immediate mass production and distribution to all armored units. The German reaction, documented in captured correspondence, revealed the psychological impact of this simple innovation. Gefreiter Wilhelm Detmer of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich wrote a letter home on July 20th that was intercepted by American intelligence when Detmer was captured 3 days later. The Americans have developed a new tank that tears through hedgerows like paper, Detmer had written. Our entire defensive system, perfected over 4 years, has been neutralized by what appears to be scrap metal welded to their tanks. The psychological effect on our troops is devastating. We no longer feel safe behind any hedgerow. The Americans can appear anywhere, at any time. Operation Cobra, the American breakout offensive, was scheduled to begin on July 25, 1944. The plan specifically exploited the mobility that Rhino tanks had restored to American armor. By the evening of July 24th, 60% of all tanks in the American First Army, over 1,200 M4 Shermans, nearly 700 M5 Stuart light tanks, and close to 300 M10 tank destroyers had been equipped with hedge-cutting devices. General Bradley issued explicit orders that Rhino tanks were not to be used in combat until Operation Cobra launched. He wanted to preserve operational security and maximize the shock when hundreds of hedge-cutting tanks were unleashed simultaneously. The Germans knew American tanks were operating in the Bocage, but they had no indication that those tanks could now move through hedgerows at will. The operation began with the largest tactical use of heavy bombers in support of ground forces yet seen in the war. At 9:40 in the morning on July 25th, 1,500 B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators began dropping over 3,000 tons of high-explosive and fragmentation bombs on German positions along a 5-mile front near Saint-Lô. Another 1,000 medium bombers and fighter bombers followed, adding nearly 1,000 more tons of bombs and napalm. The bombardment was devastating. German units in the target area, primarily the Panzer Lehr division, were shattered. Oberst Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzer Lehr, would later testify that at least 70% of his men in the bombed area were killed, wounded, or so traumatized they could no longer fight effectively. The bombing created a moonscape of craters and debris, but the bombing alone would not have been sufficient. Previous massive bombardments during the Normandy campaign had inflicted terrible casualties on German defenders, but failed to produce breakthroughs because surviving defenders could re-establish their positions in the Bocage before American tanks could exploit the bombardment. The hedgerows themselves remained intact, channeling attacking forces into killing zones where German reserves waited. This time was different. At 1100 hours, American infantry began advancing through the bombed area. Behind them came 300 Rhino tanks. The German defenders, stunned by the bombardment and still attempting to reorganize, suddenly faced tanks that appeared through hedgerows in unexpected locations. The breakthrough accelerated with shocking speed. The American 1st Infantry Division, spearheaded by 40 Rhino tanks, advanced 6 miles on July 26, farther than they had moved in the previous 3 weeks combined. The 3rd Armoured Division, with 60 Rhino tanks leading the way, advanced 8 miles. German units trained to conduct fighting withdrawals from hedgerow to hedgerow found their entire tactical system rendered useless. Private Hans Müller of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich was captured on July 27th during the breakthrough. His interrogation report, preserved in the National Archives, provides remarkable insight into German morale during the collapse. "We called them devil's horns," Müller told his interrogators, speaking of the steel tusks on American tanks. "You would be manning your position, watching the gap in the hedgerow where you knew the Americans would have to come through. Your Panzerfaust would be ready, your position carefully camouflaged. Then suddenly the earth would explode beside. You and a tank would burst through the hedgerow itself. We had no answer for it." The Panzerfaust was useless against a tank that appeared suddenly at close range from an unexpected direction. Many men simply ran. Obersturmbannführer Friedrich Wilhelm von Lindeiner, commanding a battle group of the Panzer Lehr Division, described the breakthrough in his post-war memoir with the clinical precision of professional German officers trying to understand their own defeat. "The Rhino tanks came through the hedgerows like a tide," von Lindeiner wrote. "We had positioned our anti-tank guns to cover the gaps and the tops of the hedgerows, the only approaches we thought tanks could use. Suddenly, tanks were bursting through the walls themselves, appearing in our flanks and rear. Our entire defensive scheme, rehearsed and perfected since 1940, dissolved in minutes. We had no tactical response prepared because we had not imagined this was possible." By July 28th, the German 7th Army was in full retreat. The carefully prepared defensive positions, rehearsed over 4 years of occupation, were abandoned in 3 days. American armoured spearheads led by Rhino tanks were advancing 20 miles per day, a rate of advance that seemed impossible just weeks earlier, when progress had been measured in yards. The German command structure, dependent on holding successive defensive lines in the Bocage, collapsed entirely. Field Marshal Gunther von Klug, commanding German forces in Normandy, sent increasingly desperate messages to Hitler's headquarters, describing the deteriorating situation. In 7 days, from July 25th to August 1st, American forces advanced 60 miles. They destroyed or captured 300 German tanks. They took 20,000 prisoners. They inflicted an estimated 40,000 casualties on German forces. American casualties, while significant at approximately 6,000 killed and wounded, were a fraction of what pre-Cobra estimates had predicted for an advance of this magnitude. The German disaster was complete and irreversible. On August 1st, Hitler finally authorized a withdrawal from Normandy, but the order came too late. American armored columns led by Rhino tanks had already cut off major withdrawal routes. The attempted German counterattack at Mortain on August 7th, designed to cut through to the coast and split the American forces, failed catastrophically. Rhino tanks, able to maneuver freely through Bocage country that was supposed to favor defenders, surrounded and destroyed the attacking German divisions. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge sent an urgent assessment to Hitler's headquarters on August 17th that would prove to be one of his final official communications. "The enemy has overcome the hedgerow barrier with a simple device that we failed to anticipate," von Kluge wrote. "Our entire defensive strategy in Normandy is now untenable. The American advance cannot be stopped with available forces." Von Kluge would be dead within days, having taken poison after being implicated in the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler. But his final military assessment was brutally accurate. The Western Front, stalemated for 7 weeks in the Hedgerows, had moved 400 miles in 6 weeks after the breakthrough. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Lieutenant General Walter Warlimont, Deputy Chief of the Wehrmacht Operations Staff, testified after the war about the strategic implications of the American hedge cutter. His testimony, given during the Nuremberg proceedings, was remarkable for its candor about German failures. The American hedgerow cutter invalidated 4 years of German defensive planning in France, Warlimont stated. "We had based our entire strategy for defending Normandy on the defensive value of the Bocage. The hedgerows were, in our estimation, worth several divisions of troops because they negated American advantages in mobility and firepower. When this defensive value was neutralized by a simple welding modification that cost perhaps $50 per tank, we had no alternative plan. The speed of the American advance following Operation Cobra exceeded even the most pessimistic German projections. The pursuit across France that followed was enabled entirely by the momentum gained during the Cobra breakout. The same tanks that broke through the hedgerows raced across the open country beyond, liberating Paris on August 25th and reaching the German border by September 11th. The Western Front, which had moved 5 miles in 7 weeks, advanced 400 miles in the 6 weeks after the Rhino tanks broke the stalemate. Sergeant Culin's innovation drew recognition from the highest levels of Allied command. On August 12th, he was awarded the Legion of Merit by General Eisenhower personally. The citation, preserved in Culin's service record, read, "Sergeant Curtis G. Culin III, through his ingenuity and technical skill, developed a device which restored mobility to American armored forces and directly contributed to the liberation of France." The technical details of the Culin hedgerow cutter remained classified until 1946. The Army was concerned that if exact specifications became public during the war, the Germans might develop countermeasures or adapt the principle for their own use. Post-war analysis revealed that over 500 tanks were eventually equipped with hedge cutters, using approximately 2,000 tons of German beach obstacles. The irony was not lost on American soldiers. Hitler's own defensive preparations, the Czech hedgehogs scattered across the beaches to stop the invasion, had been turned against German forces and used to break through defensive positions that were supposed to be impregnable. Tank Commander Staff Sergeant William Dentz of the 2nd Armoured Division wrote to his wife on July 30th, and his letter, one of thousands preserved in the Library of Congress collection of wartime correspondence, captured the transformation in American morale. "For 5 weeks, we've been stuck in these fields, losing friends daily," Dentz wrote. "Every attack was the same we'd try to get through. They'd be waiting, and more men would die. Now we have the Rhino, and everything has changed. We're finally moving. You can see it in everyone's eyes, hear it in their voices. For the first time since we landed, We believe we're going to win this thing." The modifications were not without problems. The added weight on the front of the tanks increased stress on transmissions. Tank drivers had to be retrained to approach hedgerows at the correct angle and speed. Too fast, and the impact could damage the prongs or throw a track. Too slow, and the tank's engine would stall while the prongs were still, buried in the embankment. The optimal speed was determined through trial and error to be between 4 and 6 miles per hour, with the driver maintaining steady throttle through the entire penetration. Some drivers compared it to pushing through deep snow. You committed to the path and powered through rather than trying to force your way. Technical Sergeant Robert Kraft, a maintenance specialist with the 3rd Armoured Division, documented the mechanical challenges in his official report dated August 10th. "The hedge cutters are causing premature wear on front bogie wheels and return rollers," Kraft wrote. "We're seeing transmission failures at 3 times the normal rate. However, these mechanical losses are acceptable compared to the catastrophic combat losses we were suffering before. We're losing tanks to mechanical failure instead of German guns, and mechanical failures can be repaired." The psychological impact on American forces was as significant as the tactical advantage. War photographer Robert Capa was present during one of the early attacks using Rhino tanks. His photographs, published in Life magazine in September 1944, showed Sherman tanks with their improvised steel tusks tearing through hedgerows while German defenders fled in apparent panic. One image became iconic. It showed a Rhino tank bursting through a hedgerow in an explosion of earth and vegetation, its steel prongs gleaming in the Norman sunlight, with infantry following close behind through the gap. The photograph captured in a single frame the transformation from siege warfare to mobile warfare. The Rhino tanks fundamentally changed American tactical possibilities. They could create new routes of advance, making German mining of existing gaps irrelevant. They could approach German positions from unexpected directions, negating carefully prepared fields of fire. They could pursue retreating German forces through terrain previously considered impossible for armor. Each of these capabilities multiplied the effectiveness of American armored forces many times over. Technical analysis conducted by the Ordnance Department after the war revealed the engineering elegance of Culin's solution. The steel prongs, positioned at the optimal 30-degree angle, acted simultaneously as cutting edges and leverage points. As the tank drove forward, the prongs would slice through roots and compress earth, creating fracture points in the hedgerow. The tank's 30-ton weight provided the force necessary to exploit these fractures and drive through. The entire process utilized the tank's existing capabilities without requiring any modification to the engine, transmission, or tracks beyond what normal maintenance could handle. The cost-effectiveness of the modification was remarkable by any measure. Each Culin hedge cutter required approximately $50 in materials and 4 hours of labor to install. The German beach obstacles provided free raw material, having been abandoned by retreating forces. In contrast, specialized British vehicles designed for obstacle breaching cost over £40,000 each and required months of specialized training for their crews. Major Geoffrey Pryor of the British 79th Armoured Division, which specialized in unusual armoured vehicles, observed American Rhino tanks in operation on August 2nd. His report to British headquarters stated with characteristic understatement, "The American hedge cutter is brilliantly simple. We spent 2 years developing specialized vehicles for every conceivable obstacle. The Americans solved their most critical tactical problem with scrap metal and welding torches in less than 2 weeks. The infantry tactics evolved rapidly to exploit Rhino tank capabilities. Instead of following tanks through predictable gaps where German artillery was pre-registered, infantry would wait until Rhino tanks penetrated hedgerows at multiple points simultaneously, then flood through the new openings. This dispersed the infantry, making them far less vulnerable to artillery and machine gun fire. German attempts to counter the Rhino tanks proved completely ineffective. Initially, they tried placing larger mines in hedgerows, but the tanks' momentum carried them through before mines could cause critical damage. They attempted to reinforce hedgerows with steel beams, but this was impractical given the thousands of hedgerows in Normandy. They tried concentrating anti-tank guns to cover likely penetration points, but Rhino tanks could create new penetration points anywhere along any hedgerow. General Eisenhower, in a letter to Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall dated August 20th, wrote, "The hedge cutter has operational and strategic implications beyond its tactical utility. By restoring mobility to our armoured forces, it has prevented the campaign from becoming a replay of World War I's trench warfare. We are now conducting mobile operations across France at a pace that exceeds our most optimistic pre-invasion planning." After the war, Curtis Culin married Bernice Enright in 1945. They lived in New York City, where he worked for Schenley Industries, the same company that had employed him before the war. The personal impact on Culin was significant but complicated. He had been promoted and transferred to other duties after his innovation gained recognition. He remained uncomfortable with celebrity, preferring to credit the soldiers who had helped him develop and test the device. In interviews, he consistently maintained, "I just saw a problem and figured out how to fix it with what we had available." 4 months after his innovation changed the war, Culin lost a leg to a landmine in the Hurtgen forest. He was 48 years old when he died on November 20th, 1963, in Greenwich Village, Manhattan. He had kept a section of a hedge cutter prong as a memento of his wartime service, but rarely spoke about the innovation that had altered the course of the war in Europe. The French government considered his contribution invaluable. In 1948, Culin was awarded the Croix de Guerre with Palm by the French Republic. The citation read, "For an innovation that liberated French soil from Nazi occupation and saved countless French lives." The ceremony was held in the town of Saint-Lô, which had been 95% destroyed in the fighting before the breakout. In military education, the Culin hedge cutter became a standard case study in innovation and adaptation. Staff colleges around the world taught the principle that tactical innovation could come from any level of command. The story challenged the traditional top-down approach to military problem-solving and encouraged officers to listen to enlisted personnel's ideas. In 2004, on the 60th anniversary of D-Day, a memorial was dedicated to Sergeant Culin in Saint-Lô. The memorial features a replica hedge cutter mounted on a preserved Sherman tank. The inscription reads, "To Sergeant Curtis G. Culin III, whose innovation broke the stalemate and opened the door to liberation." The hedgerows of Normandy still stand today, many bearing scars from 1944. Tourists can see the marks where Rhino tanks burst through, the steel prongs leaving distinctive gouges that have not healed after 80 years. These scars are monuments to American innovation and determination, permanent reminders of the day a sergeant's simple idea changed the course of history. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.